Okay, thank you, Dennis. My name is David G. I'm a grateful recovering alcoholic and a sexaholic. I have a sobriety date in AA of August 8th, 1994, and a sobriety date in SA, October 1st of 2019. I'm really grateful to be here to share experience, strength, and hope today. We are in the chapter, There is a Solution. For the past few weeks, we've been journeying through the big book from the title page up to where we are at now. We looked at the history of AA, and then, of course, we looked at the doctor's opinion. We got some really good news there that our problem wasn't only mental, it was physical as well. That was something that a lot of us had known before. I definitely didn't, before coming into the program and learning how to study the book versus just reading it. The doctor talked about a phenomenon of craving. He talked about once that we put this in our body, for whatever reason, something takes over on the inside of us, and it makes it absolutely impossible for us to stop. But we also seen that if that was the only problem, the only thing we would need to do is not drink or not take lust into our system, and then we should be okay. But once we stop, then the real problem begins to show up, the problem in the mind, and it begins to lie to us. It's devious, it's cunning, baffling, and powerful, and for some reason I always believe the lie one more time, that I can do this, and this time it'll be without danger, or the consequences won't be as bad. And each time I do that, something within me takes over once again, the physical part, and then I'm going over and over and over. And so we looked at that, and then we took an inside look at Bill's story. We looked at the co-founder and his experience. We seen how the disease had progressed in him to the point to where he bottomed out on several occasions and tried to quit over and over and over to no avail. We seen that, where he finally had met Dr. Silkworth, who explained to him the nature of his illness. Although Bill knew this information, it helped him for a little while, but he relapsed and then he was gone once again. His friend Abby Thatcher came to him with a solution, which we're going to look at today. The solution he presented to Bill is the solution that Bill is going to present to us in chapter 2. There is a solution. Bill couldn't go for that idea. He didn't like that. And they sat at the kitchen table. They argued for a little while. Finally, Ebby said something to him that was epic. He told him, "Why don't you choose your own conception of God?" That statement hit Bill hard. At that point, he was able to experience the second step while sitting at the kitchen table. While drinking, he went back to the town's hospital and worked the steps and recovered. And so we had come that far in our book study. Last week, we opened up to There is a Solution, and we began to look at the power, at two powers. We started to look at the power of the fellowship, which is absolutely vital for us. The bad news is that most of us come here to believe that that's the only thing we need to do. The first half of the chapter talks a lot about that. It gives us a lot of warnings that, although that's vital and we have to have it, that's not going to be enough for us to recover. The last half of the chapter is going to talk about the power of the spiritual experience. And so the fellowship will carry us as far as it can, but at some point we're going to have that experience with a power greater than ourselves in order to recover. And they're going to give examples of that this week as we take an inside look at that in the big book. We started on page 17 last week looking at There is a Solution. And there is probably, I heard it said in AA a lot of times, there are probably as many solutions as there is alcoholics. But my book is very clear that there is a solution. And so that's what I try to focus on. As any great writer always has, Bill would start on page 17 talking about something that they could understand in that day. He talked about the great ocean liner, and in those days, if they were going to go from one continent to another, they had to do this. There was no airplane travel at that time. And so he began to talk to them about that, talking about they were people that normally would not mix. There exists among them a fellowship, a friendliness, understanding. And, he would give examples over and over of that. On page 18, we took a look at, how to be a sponsor in this program and how to find a sponsor in this program. The last two paragraphs on page 18 kind of opened that up for us. And it goes on to talk more about the fellowship. As we got over, we took a look at three different types of drinkers. We looked at the moderate drinker, we looked at the hard drinker, and we looked at the real alcoholic. And what we've seen as we looked at the real alcoholic is that the only thing that was different in us versus the other two was the allergy once we started to drink. As we moved on through that, we got over to about the end of page 22, and that's where I'd like to start with us today, On the bottom paragraph of page 22, Bill says this. He says, "We know that while the alcoholic keeps away from drink as he may do for months or years, he reacts much like other men. And I can say through my drinking years that when I didn't have any alcohol in my system and I wasn't on a running binge, that was the same thing for me. I reacted a whole lot like other people do. I had a job. I was able to go to work. I was able to interact somewhat with the family. The same way with lust. Once I got lust out of my system, it felt like I was getting a little bit of sobriety. You know, I was able to act much like other men do. But look at what he says in the next sentence or two. It's really important for me to take a close look at this. He said, we are equally positive that once, and I think that's our key word there, once, he takes any alcohol or any lust, whatever, into his system, something happens, both in the bodily, mentally sense, which makes it virtually impossible for him to stop. The experience of any alcoholic will abundantly confirm this. So I know that whenever I come into the fellowship and I get alcohol out of my body, it is said that after 72 hours an alcohol exits the body, that man is as sober as I am at 26 years sitting here today. The problem is no longer in the body. The problem is in the mind. For me, I thought that I was craving alcohol. I thought I was craving the lust. I thought I was craving, and I was fighting over and over with the craving. But come to find out, as a result of what this book told me and looking at my experience, I see that I wasn't fighting the craving during that time. I was fighting the obsession to the mind, and I did not know that. So therefore, you know, I had it completely backwards. I was praying for the craving to be taken away, but I wasn't craving. I was obsessing. And so we're going to look at what he says, starting with these observations. We're going to look at what he talks about our mind. From this point on in the book, we're not going to really look anymore at what he talks about with the physical allergy, the body. At this point, that's no longer going to be a part of this. Now we're going to look at the mind. What sets us up for relapse over and over and over? We come into this fellowship. We come in here. We start to get some sobriety. We're feeling pretty good. We're doing pretty good. And all of a sudden, lust hits us and takes us out. It's like, my God, how did that happen? Alcohol hit me. It would take me out. I think, my God, how did that happen? But he will make it pretty clear here that at this point, the fellowship has carried me probably as far as it can, and they're going to be there to continue to carry me as much as they can, but I'm going to need something more than that in order to recover. So let's look at what he says, starting with these observations. These observations would be academic and pointless if our friend never took the first drink or he never had the lust enter his body. In other words, these observations, everything that we've observed in these prior 22 pages, it wouldn't even matter if he never took a drink or the allergy was never activated. It wouldn't matter because we would never act out. We would never drink. We would never get drunk. The allergy would never be activated. He says, thereby setting the terrible cycle in motion. Therefore, the main problem of the alcoholic and the main problem of the lustaholic is centers in his mind rather than in his body. So if you ask him why he started on that last bender, chances is he will offer you one of 100 alibis. Now, sometimes these excuses have a certain plausibility, but none of them really make sense in the light of the havoc an alcoholic drinking bout creates. They sound like the philosophy of a man who, having a headache, beats himself on the head with a hammer so he can't feel the ache. If you draw this fallacious reasoning to the attention of an alcoholic, he will laugh it off or become irritated and refuse to talk. And that was my experience over and over and over. Once in a while, he may tell the truth. I don't know about you, but I was one of the biggest liars in my disease. And then even after I got into sobriety for a little while, it was hard for me to tell the truth about anything because I didn't know what the truth was. And the truth is, strange to say, is usually I have no idea why I took that first drink than you have. I have no idea why I acted out again after 3 or 4 months of sobriety. Things were going well. I was doing good. I was praying. I was going to meeting on a regular basis. And the next thing you know, lust would hit. And I would act out and I'd be going again. And I just think, my God, this is never going to end. Look at the bottom 3 sentences in that same paragraph. He says, there is the obsession. And that's what we're going to look at. The obsession somehow, someday, that we will beat the game, but they often suspect they are down for the count. How true this is, and few realize in a vague way, their families and friends sense that these drinkers are abnormal, but everyone hopefully awaits the day when the sufferer will rise from his lethargy and assert his power of will. And for me, that day never came. I tried over and over and over. I would come to meetings, I would work the steps saying, okay, I'm gonna work the steps. It will take the lust away. It will take the acting out away. And then I won't ever have to deal with that again. And I would end up acting out again and again. That was baffling. I didn't understand what it was until I came back this time. The tragic truth is, if the man be a real alcoholic, the happy day may not arrive. He has lost control. And I think this is something that we really should pay close attention to in this book. I hear it said in meetings a lot of times. I'm thankful today that I have a choice whether or not I drink or whether or not I act out. Now, I've read the literature for a long time and a lot of years. I don't really ever see anywhere where we get that choice back. We're asked to make a choice in the chapter 2, We Agnostics, but it doesn't really have anything to do with whether or not I'm going to do this or not today. I've lost the power to choose that. In my experience, I've never got that back, and I don't know anybody else that has either. So he says at a certain point in the drinking career of every alcoholic, he passes into a state. That's an interesting word, state, where the most powerful desire to stop drinking or to stop lusting or acting out is of absolutely no avail. Can anybody relate to that? I bet you most people on this call can relate to that. This tragic situation has already arrived in practically every case long before it is expected. Now let's look at this squiggly writing real carefully. Anytime that we see squiggly writing in the big book, it is definitely there for a reason, and it's important information for us to retain. The fact, not the theory, the fact is that most alcoholics, most lust addicts, sexaholics, not all, but most, for reasons yet obscure, very powerful words here, have lost the power of choice and drink or acting out. I lost the power to do for that, and I don't get that power back. I used to run around in the early days in the meetings, and I would run around saying, thank God I have a choice whether or not I drink. My sponsor was in the meeting with me one day, and I remember him cornering me up after it was over outside. And he said, let me ask you a question. He said, you really feel like you have the power to choose whether or not you will drink or act out today? And I said, I do. And he said, well, let me ask you a question. He said, when you got up this morning, who did you ask to keep you sober today? I said, well, God, of course, God. He said, then David, where is really your choice? Had you not chose God, what would you have chose? And I had to take a close look at that, because my choice would always be lust, the drink, the drug, no matter what it was. If I don't choose God, my choice is always going to be the other. And that's been my experience. The next sentence proves it. My so-called willpower becomes practically non-existent. It just doesn't exist. We're unable at certain times to bring into our consciousness with sufficient force the memory, the suffering, humiliation of even a week or a month ago. We are without defense against the first drink. The almost certain consequences that follow taking even a glass of beer don't even crowd into the mind to deter us. If these thoughts occur, they are hazily and readily supplanted with the old threadbare idea that this time I will handle myself like other people. There is a complete failure of the kind of defense that keeps one from putting his hand on a hot stove. I was fortunate enough to get to work with Joe and Charlie through the years, and he would always tell a story about the hot stove to where he had backed his rear up and touched that stove one night by accident when he was a young boy. And he said, never did I have the obsession to the mind to stick my tail to that stove ever again. He said, but you can take alcohol, and in my case, I could take lust, and it has burned me over and over and over and over, and it's almost like I would stick my tail back to that stove every single time. That's not normal. So, bottom paragraph here. When this sort of thinking is fully established in an individual with alcoholic tendencies, he has probably placed himself beyond human aid. Now, if I place myself beyond human aid, the support of the fellowship has carried me as far as it's going to. I'm not going to be able to depend on it for my recovery all the way through. I'm going to have more than that. Thank God for the fellowship. They brought me in, they shook my hand, they hugged my neck. They told me what I needed to do. I needed to find a sponsor. I needed to work the steps. I needed to get into the book. But these were things that I had to do. They say that God will do for us what we cannot do for ourselves, but there's a whole lot of things that we can do for ourselves. And so we're going to start seeing what that is. The book says, unless we are locked up, we may die or go permanently insane. These stark and ugly facts have been confirmed by legions of alcoholics throughout history. But for the grace of God, there would have been thousands more convincing demonstrations. So many want to stop but cannot. And that has been my story most of my life. I wanted to stop. I could not stop. I've tried everything to stop doing what I was doing. And I relapsed and relapsed and relapsed for almost 25 years with lust. And it was just ungodly where that ended up taking me in the end. But the good news is this. There is a solution. Thank God for that. That's a promise. There is a solution. Now, what he's about to tell us that it didn't strike me as being very inviting in the beginning, but he's telling me it's going to be necessary. Let's see what he says here. Almost none of us like the self-searching, the leveling of our pride. That's step 4 in this program. We know that the self-searching, the leveling of our pride, that's all going to come as a result of the inventory work that we're going to do coming up. The confession of our shortcomings, that's step 5. We know that once we confess our shortcomings to another, that's step 5. But look what he says in these next sentences, which the process requires for its successful consummation. So it tells me right there, without a thorough 4th and 5th step, the solution is going to be way out of reach. And I never had seen that before. I read that a lot of times, and I looked at that, but I had never seen it the way that it's outlined right there. So in other words, he's saying there is a solution. None of us like doing step 4 or step 5, but that's what this process requires to be successful. And wow, what an eye-opener. But we saw that it really worked in others. I seen it in you folks. I heard it in your story. I heard a lady that's on the call today share it last week. Beautiful story. You know, I see it in you folks. I see it. He says, and had come to believe in the hopelessness and futility of life as I'd been living it. See, that's step 1, the hopelessness. When therefore we were approached, remember we looked at that on page 18 last week, who would do the approaching and the role of a sponsorship, that they would approach us, that they would bring us the message. And he says it again here, when therefore we were approached by those in whom the problem had been solved, there's a promise. There was nothing left for us but to pick up the simple kit of spiritual tools laid at our feet. We have found much of heaven, and we had been rocketed into a 4th dimension of existence which we had not even dreamed. If you'll hold your place right there and go back to page 8 in this book, I want to take a look at Bill's story, because a lot of times he's going to talk about this 4th dimension, but it's only here that I've ever found, especially in this book, that he gives really a clear-cut example of what that 4th dimension looks like. Most of us know the mental, the physical, the spiritual, but Bill talks about a 4th dimension. And so in the middle of the page where he says trembling, if you'll drop down to about the last 2 sentences, he says, I was soon to be catapulted in what I like to call the 4th dimension of existence. I was to know happiness, peace, and usefulness, and a way of life that is incredibly more wonderful as time passes. Now, I've had those experiences a lot of times, but they always are fleeting and soon lost. But Bill tells us here that it will be incredibly more wonderful as time passes, and I think that's the key, as time passes. And so he's going to give us an example of what that is. Now, there was a guy that stood in between the judge and Ebby Thatcher, and this man's name was Roland Hazard. And so Roland is one that they're going to give an idea of. I think that, you know, a lot of people in our program get it confused that our steps came from religion. They came from the problem, the solution. But as I read this book carefully, I see that that's not really the truth, because we see that the problem was discovered by Dr. Silkworth, a little doctor in New York City. We're going to see now that the solution was the idea that came from a man named Dr. Carl Jung, who was in Europe. And the other 10 steps came from the Oxford group, and none of these folks were alcoholics or addicts. So we want to take a look at the spiritual experience. Joe of Joe and Charlie always told a story about an aunt of his that was named Aunt Much. And he said she was just a big burly woman, and Joe was always made to go to the church. And in the South, I mean, that's kind of a requirement growing up. If you don't go, you get beat, and you go anyway. But anyway, he was there that night, and his aunt began to have what they told him was a spiritual experience. She would begin to flop on the floor and jump around and do all of these things. And he was really scared at what he saw that was going on. And when he asked his family what was wrong with his aunt, they told him that she was having a spiritual experience. So whenever he came into the fellowship and he began to recover, they told him that he was going to have a spiritual experience in order to recover. So his mind automatically went back to that time. And it scared him. He thought, I can't do this. I'm not going to do this. There's just no way. Well, thank God that's not the case for all of us, that there's another way. And Bill's going to give us some examples here that we can look at. So let's look at where he says the great fact is just this and nothing less, that we have had deep and effective spiritual experience. And see the little asterisk there. And if you'll look down to the very bottom of the page, it says this is fully explained, Appendix 2, and that's something that we should take a look at in a few minutes and kind of go over that as well. Because if I'm going to have one of these spiritual experiences, I really want to know what it is. And so, but he says that they've been deep and they've been effective, but this is what it is. You see, it revolutionized my whole attitude toward life. See, I don't really know, it's been so long ago, what I thought that my idea of a spiritual experience was. I didn't think it had to do with a whole lot of change on my part. I just thought it was something God was going to zap me with. It may be lightning from the sky, a thunderbolt. Something was going to happen, and I was going to have an experience, and I was going to be okay. I wasn't going to have to do a whole lot of work. Well, that's not been the case for me. And that's what he said right there. He said, this has revolutionized our whole attitude toward life. And I can tell you, as a result of being here and working these steps, my attitude toward life has changed a whole lot. I still have days where other people question that, but I can tell you that I've had a profound alteration in my reaction to life. But look what he says toward our fellows, and that's somebody that I was always in conflict with, was my fellows, toward God's universe. The central fact of our life today, right now, is the absolute certainty that the Creator has entered into my heart and lives in a way which is indeed miraculous. He has commenced to accomplish those things for us which we could never do by ourselves. We will see more of that as we get over around page 83. There's a lot more that can be said about the things he can do for us, which we never had done for ourselves. But it's beautiful. It's just a beautiful experience as a result of these 12 steps. So he says, if you're as seriously alcoholic as we were, we believe there's no middle of the road solution. We were in a position where life was becoming impossible. Can anybody relate to that toward the end of their acting out? And if we had passed into the region, look at that word region. Look at the top of page 24. He talks about the word state. It goes from a state to a region. There's quite a big difference between a state and a region. From which there is no return through human aid, we have but two alternatives. One, to go on to the bitter end, blotting out the consciousness of our intolerable situation as best we could. That's step one. The other, to accept spiritual help. Step two. Now, my wife is a survivor of breast cancer. And I know for a fact, if I was to take this book down and say, look, take this book, read it, do exactly what it says, and I promise you, you can get up out of here and you can walk out of here a free man or woman, everybody in there would jump on that. I've worked with alcoholics and addicts and sexaholics that want to take a couple of days to think this over. And that's been my experience as well. You offer me a solution out of this, and, I want to think it over. It's insane the way that we believe. So talking about the spiritual experience, let's take a journey to the back of the book, and I think it's on page 567 in the 4th edition. We want to look at a spiritual experience, because if I'm going to have one of these, I definitely want to know a little bit more about it. The term spiritual experience, and this is what Bill had. Bill had a spiritual experience. He had that flash of light experience in the town's hospital that changed his life. And spiritual awakening, that's for some of us, it comes a lot slower. It's not that sudden. in the first edition of the book, they didn't have this spiritual experience in the back. So people were writing in, Bill, you talk a lot about spiritual experience, spiritual awakening. What does this mean? What does this mean? So this was added. And this is what he said. The term spiritual experience and spiritual awakening are used many times in this book, which upon careful reading, and I think right there is the key to the whole book, not just in this part of the book, but the whole book. If we will carefully read the book, if we will carefully study the book and do what the book says, we will have what he's fixing to call right here a personality change sufficient to bring about recovery from alcoholism, sexaholism, drug addiction, any kind of ism. I've seen that personality change sufficient to bring about recovery happen in a lot of lives. It's a beautiful thing. But it's manifested itself among us in many different forms. Yet it is true that our first printing gave many readers the impression that these personality changes, see there it is again, or religious experience must be in the nature of a sudden and spectacular upheaval. So the word upheaval, it means to change. We're going to see constantly change, 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 change. And that's what's required for us to recover. We're going to have to change. Happily for everyone, this conclusion is erroneous. So I thought for me, the only thing I needed to do was come here and not drink anymore. I needed to come here and not act out anymore. And then my life should be okay. I should be able just to sail on into the sunset and everything will be okay. There's a lot of character defects that remain with me. And those are things that I'm going to have to continue to keep an eye out and watch for from now on, not just the day that I stop. In fact, that's the first part. In the first few chapters, a number of sudden revolutionary changes, there it is again, are described. Though it was not our intention to create such an impression, many alcoholics have nevertheless concluded that in order to recover, not just get sober, not just stop acting out, but to recover, they must acquire an immediate and overwhelming God consciousness, followed at once by a vast change in feeling and outlook. Now, among our rapidly growing membership of thousands of alcoholics, such transformation, the word transformation means change, though frequent, are by no means the rule. Most of our experience is what the psychologist William James calls the educational variety, and this is what happened to me and most of the people I know, because they develop slowly over a period of time. Quite often, friends of the newcomer are aware of the difference long before he is himself. Well, he finally realizes he has undergone a profound alteration in his reaction to life. The alteration means change. That such a change, there it is again, could hardly have been brought about by himself alone. What often takes place in a few months could have seldom been accomplished by years of self-discipline. With few exceptions, our members find that they have tapped an unsuspected inner resource, which they presently identify with their own conception of a power greater than themselves. Most of us think that this awareness of a power greater than ourselves is the essence of a spiritual experience. Our more religious members call it God consciousness. Most emphatically, we wish to say that any alcoholic capable of honestly facing his problems in the light of our experience can recover, provided he does not close his mind to all spiritual concepts. He can only be defeated by an attitude of intolerance or belligerent denial. We have found that no one need have difficulty with the spirituality of the program. Willingness, honesty, and open-mindedness are the essentials of recovery, but these are indispensable. There is a principle which is a bar against all information, which is proof against all argument, and which cannot fail to keep a man in everlasting ignorance. That principle is contempt prior to investigation, and that was a quote by Herbert Spencer. So going back to page 26, we're going to take a look at this man named Roland Hazard. And we want to look, starting with him in the very first paragraph, full paragraph there on page 26. A certain American businessman had ability, good sense, and high character. When I look at this book, I ask myself, have I had those things in my life? Are those things that I possessed prior to this illness just taking me down to make me feel like the lowest piece of scum on the earth? And I would think at times I did, other times no. But look what happened to him. He had floundered from one sanitarium to another, and that's what happened to me. One meeting to another, one treatment center to another, one sanitarium. My sponsor tells me the nut house today, what they called in those days, is a high dollar word for treatment center today. In fact, he asked me, when are you going to start talking about the times that you were in the nut house? And I said, I was never in the nut house. Thank you very much. And he said, you was in treatment, I know for a fact, about 4 or 5 different times. And I said, yeah, I was. And he said, that's the nut house. So the book says he had consulted the best known American psychiatrist. Then he had gone to Europe, placing himself in the care of the celebrated physician, the psychiatrist, Dr. Jung. It seemed like there were 3 top psychiatrists of that day. It seems like there was, of course, Dr. Freud, Dr. Abner, and there were Dr. Jung. And so I think that Roland had, my memory serves me well, he had tried to get in with the other 2 prior to going to Dr. Jung. But as the story is going to play out, thank God that he ended up with Dr. Jung. It said, who prescribed for him, though experience had made it skeptical, he finished his treatment with unusual confidence. His physical and mental conditions were good. Above all, he believed he had acquired such a profound knowledge of the inner working of its mind and its hidden spring that relapse was unthinkable. And I've seen this a lot in the fellowship over the years. We come in here, we start doing the steps, we get a home group, we start making a meeting, we start doing really well. And for some reason, there's a part of our mind that thinks, I will never do that again. That's very dangerous. That's what happened with this man. This man had spent a year with Dr. Jung. He had taken a boat. He had went across the continent. He had went to Europe. He had got with this man, and they spent a year together. On the day that he left to go back to the boat to come home, he was drunk before he made it. Baffled, just absolutely baffled at why he would drink after a year, because as he had said right there in those 2 sentences, he believed he had acquired such a profound knowledge of the inner working of his mind and his hidden springs that relapse was unthinkable. But nevertheless, he was drunk in a short time. More baffling still, he could give himself no satisfactory explanation for his fall. So he returned to this doctor, Dr. Jung, whom he admired, and asked him point blank why he could not recover. And I think this next sentence tells us why he could not recover. And I think it tells us why we cannot recover if we have this attitude. He wished above all things to regain self-control. Now, I don't know about you, but I know about me. If I've only come here to regain self-control, the chances are that I'm going to relapse. My experience shows that I'm going to relapse, and the same thing happened to Roland. He wanted to regain self-control. I don't believe that ever happens for us, not with the disease. He seemed quite rational and well-balanced with respect to other problems, yet he had no control over alcohol. Why was this? He begged the doctor to tell him the whole truth, and he got it. In the doctor's judgment, he was utterly hopeless. He could never regain his position in society, and he would have to place himself under lock and key or hire a bodyguard if he expected to live long. That was a great physician's opinion. But this man, talking about Roland, still lives and he is a free man. And he does not need a bodyguard, nor is he confined, and he can go anywhere on this earth other free men go without disaster, provided there is a condition, and here it is. He remains willing to maintain a certain simple attitude. In other words, there's more work to be done than just to come here and get sober. Some of our alcoholic readers may think that they can do without spiritual help. Let us tell you the rest of the conversation our friend Roland had with his doctor. The doctor said, you have the mind of a chronic alcoholic, and I have never seen one single case recover. Where the state of mind, and I think that is the key word, the state of mind existed to the extent that it does in you. Our friend felt as though the gates of hell had closed on him with a clang, and I felt like that many times. I can remember being in a treatment center, a detox several times, coming out of there in less than a week. I would drink again, or I would act out again. And one time they even put me on antabuse, and they told me, if you drink on this, there's a good possibility it'll kill you. And I had absolutely no intention on drinking. In less than a week, I was drunk on antabuse, and it was one of the worst experiences that I ever had. I did almost die from that. So, I can relate to Roland when he talks about the gates of hell being closed on him with a clang. He said to the doctor, is there no exception? Yes, replied the doctor, there is exceptions. Cases such as yours have been occurring since early times. Here and there, once in a while, alcoholics have had what are called vital spiritual experiences. To me, these occurrences are phenomena. But here it is again. Here's the description of the spiritual experiences, I like to look at it today. It's not what Ain't Much had whenever she fell on the floor and she flopped around. She done all that stuff. I'm glad that worked for her, but that would not work for me. But I can accept what he's about to tell me here. This spiritual experience is going to appear to be in the nature of a huge emotional displacement and rearrangement. Now, I don't know about you, but I know about me, and that's the first thing that needs to be rearranged and displaced and rearranged when I get here is a lot of my emotional stuff that I have going on. Look at what he says. Ideas, emotions, and attitudes, which were once the guiding forces of the lives of these men, are suddenly cast to one side. And when we get over to page 73 in the book, we're going to take a close look at how these things are cast away from our consciousness. It's a beautiful process. And a completely new set of conceptions and motives begin to dominate them. That's what the spiritual experience looks like for me today. In fact, I've been trying to produce some such emotional rearrangement. Look at this word, within you. See, we're beyond human aid. No human can do that for us. Well, that is something that can only come from the power of the spiritual experience. With many individuals, the methods I have employed are successful, but I have never been successful with an alcoholic of your description. Important paragraph from here to pay attention to. Upon hearing this, our friend Roland was somewhat relieved, for he reflected that after all, he was a good church member. I reflected on that many times. I'd been to church, I'd been to AA, I'd been to therapy, I'd been to meetings, I'd done all the stuff, treatment centers. So I reflected back on that and thought, hey, that's great. But look what the doctor told him. He said, this hope, however, was destroyed by the doctor telling him that while his religious convictions were very good, in his case, it did not spell the necessary vital spiritual experience. So for a doctor to step outside of his field and tell him something like that, I think that that's admirable. I really do, because Charlie always said that he could have told Roland, you know what, you're low in your Valium deficiency. Let me write you this prescription. You come back for another year. We can work together. But see, he didn't do that. He stepped outside of his field and what he knew, and he told him, said, I don't think I can help you. I think that this is going to have to be a spiritual experience or else. And so I'm really grateful that he did that. So here was the terrible dilemma, which is step one for most of us, in which our friend found himself when he had that extraordinary experience, which we have already told you made him a free man. There's a promise. We, in our turn, sought the same escape with the desperation of drowning men. When I was 9 months sober in 1994, it was almost 1995, I had just trashed the lives of everybody, including my children, and I was starting to rebuild that relationship, and I was getting into recovery, and I was going to get my children for the summer for the first time in all those years. And my son had just turned 6 years old, and they were out. It was a Memorial Day event. And it was in Indiana, and there was a lot of flooding during that time of year. And long story short was he ended up drowning a week before I was to go get him. And it was terrible because they had some people there, and one man, he was diving trying to save him, and that man drowned as well. And so I often think of that whenever I read this and I look at this disease that's in most of us. We, in our turn, sought the same escape with the desperation of drowning men. I bet you they were fighting for their life in a way that nobody ever had before, trying to save it, and they died. And I've seen that happen over and over and over in this fellowship. Usually until a person is at this point in their recovery, it seems like if there's anything left in us, any kind of fight left whatsoever, we're going to seek that out and we're going to go for it. So for me, I never want to lose the desperation of a drowning man. Whenever the gift of desperation is a beautiful thing here. It's not a bad thing. For me, it's a good thing. So what seemed at first a flimsy reed has proved to be the loving and powerful hand of God. Ask anybody that's been in this fellowship for a long period of time, have worked the steps, and they will tell you the loving and powerful hand of God is the most important thing in our life today. Look at this promise. A new life has been given us, or if you prefer, a design for living that really works. So let's go to page 29 and we'll try to finish up. He says, let's back up to 28, bottom paragraph. In the following chapter, there appears to be an explanation on alcoholism as we understand it, and that will be the ending chapter to step one. Then a chapter addressed to the agnostics. That entire chapter will address step two. Many who were once in this class are now among our members. surprisingly enough, we find such conviction no great obstacle to a spiritual experience. But here's the greatest promise in this chapter for me. Further on, clear-cut directions are given showing how we recovered. Not just got sober, but recovered. These are followed by 42 personal experience. Each individual in his personal story describes in his own language and from his own point of view the way he established his relationship with God. That's something that was different for me coming here rather than what I tried to acquire in religion. It was their idea of who God was. When I came here, I got to choose my conception of God. Big difference. These give a fair cross-section of our membership and a clear-cut idea of what's actually happened in their life. We hope no one will consider these self-revealing accounts in bad taste. Our hope is that many alcoholic, sexaholic, lustaholic, drug addicts, whoever it is, men and women, desperately in need, there's step one. We'll see these pages. I think that's the most important two words right there in that paragraph. These pages. And believe that it is only by fully disclosing ourselves and our problems that they will be persuaded to say, yes, I am one of them too. I need to ask myself that question. And the other question I must ask, I must have this thing. And that's it's a beautiful solution today. When I first seen it, I didn't like it any more than Bill liked it when Ebby brought it to him. But as the years have went by, I can tell you it's the best decision that I've ever made. There is a solution here, and that's the greatest hope for we sexaholics, alcoholics that there ever could be. There is a way out, but there is work to be done, and we're the ones that's going to do it. I can't just say, God, take this away and sit back and enjoy the rest of my life without doing anything. For me, it just has not worked that way. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it back over to Dennis, and I thank you guys for sitting through that with me. I hope that something came from it. Thank you, Dennis.